Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Last Week This Morning, where Markham and I recap the top stories from Energy Media's coverage last week. And man, was it a busy week, Markham. I have to say, it was hard to keep track of everything that was going on. One obvious story, which people might kind of see, feels like it falls outside of our regular coverage, was the teacher strike in Alberta. And I mean, I want to get into it. I want to say it's really important on a bunch of different levels, and it's really an example of how this government uh, deals with issues. So, I mean, what can you say, Markham?
Well, what I want to make the point that what we have a journalism model here, which is that we're very expert oriented. And so we interview experts on from around the world on energy matters, but the model itself is easily applicable to any topic. And
Yeah,
so over the years, starting with COVID and the pandemic in 2020, there are key issues like new key news stories that we think our viewers really need expert information on it. This is important. So during COVID, I interviewed like 70 researchers and scientists from around the world about the virus. And the teacher strike in Alberta is very important for a lot of reasons. And the constitutional issue around Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, and
yeah.
whether or not the Smith government will use that to shield back to work legislation from being reviewed by the courts is absolutely critical. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about a general strike if she does that. And by the way, that's today. Today, she introduces the
Yes.
back to work legislation, and we will know whether or not she invokes the notwithstanding clause. And if she does, as Gil McGowan, the president of the Alberta Federation, Labor Federation, said on to a couple of interviews, then the labor movement in Alberta is en masse, united together, going to respond, and it'll be a province-wide action. Now, whether that's a general strike but this is big news, folks. And so we are using that our our model to provide you with information on an up-to-date basis and try to get, behind the story, why things are happening, how things are happening, and that's why we're covering something that isn't energy.
So let's start there. I mean, there was a couple interviews last week where we covered this issue, but let's start with that one with Gil McGowan, president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Um, you know, well, there was actually two. There was one earlier on in the week, and then you also covered Gil and the teachers union and some other labor activists were out en masse at a rally at the legislature last week. So, what did Gil have to say?
Well, the rally at Edmonton, and by the way, my standard disclosure of conflict of interest. My daughter's a teacher in
Right?
Calgary. My son-in-law teaches, or sorry, works for the Calgary Board of Education. So conflict of interest declared. Um, but basically, there were 30,000 people there. I mean, it was massive. Probably the biggest rally that's ever been held on the Alberta legislature grounds. And I think that became very clear that invoking back to work legislation is one thing. And
Yeah.
we'll also be talking about an interview I did with Jason Foster of Athabasca University, who very laid out all the options, like what happens if Smith forces teachers back to work. There's already in the legislation very clear processes and steps that will be carried that will kick in depending on which way the government goes. And if you haven't already, folks, you can find Jason's interview on our YouTube channel. Go check it out. In very clear language and very succinctly, he explains exactly how this process can unfold. Because it's kind of nerdy, right? It's like, the act and the regulations and how mediators and labor relations board work and stuff that we don't normally, it
Yeah.
just doesn't show up in the news. And people don't have a lot of experience with it or understanding of it. So, Jason did a great job. So go look at that. But then Gil's the president, right, and of the AFL, and he was pretty fiery about it.
He was.
If Alberta Premier Danielle Smith brings in back to work legislation and then invokes the notwithstanding clause, which would enable her to prevent her legislation from being reviewed by courts, it's a powder keg. And we'll know later today. We'll be bringing you coverage, interviews maybe with Gil and other experts about what's transpiring, depending on what Smith does. But this is an explosive story, and we'll be covering it in detail later today.
Well, what I wanted to highlight for folks too is in that Jason Foster interview, who is the law professor from Athabasca University, was what happens if workers defy the order of going back to work. So this is actually something that it to me is really interesting and a province-wide action. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. The government orders people back to work and they don't actually go back to work. And so if you want to, I think Jason covered it really well, kind of discussing all the implications of what that might mean.
Right. And, for the union leaders themselves, they might be fined.
Yeah,
The union can be fined. I think it's
yeah,
$1,000 a day.
yeah,
And then union leaders can be fined. And while Jason thinks this is highly unlikely, because there's 51,000 teachers out on strike,
right.
individual union members can be fined.
Yeah,
Now that's under the existing legislation. But if Smith brings back, well, she is introducing back to work legislation in that bill, she could change all of that. She could
right.
increase the penalties for the union if they defy the legislation, and
Right.
and and bring in penalties for individual members, maybe high profile people or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
So this, depending on what Smith does, it could get really, really nasty in a hurry. And so it's now we're kind of sitting on the fence, waiting to see which way she's going to tip. And the betting is that this is a union busting move, and so the legislation is likely to be more onerous than what's already in place. That's the betting. And then the question becomes how onerous? How big are the fines? How big are the penalties? Is there jail time involved? I mean, there's all sorts of things. But she has said, and she's used this language very carefully, that the strike is causing irreparable harm to students and parents. Now, I mean, keeping kids out of school is not, there is harm in that. Everybody gets that.
yeah,
But this really has become a fight for public education
yeah,
because her government has shifted more funding over to private schools and is squeezing the public system. And folks, this is a theme we're going to be exploring in more detail later on this week in the series that we're doing around Trump Project 2025 and Canada. And that is and I'll explain how Trump fits into is connected to this issue or this story. But the series of interviews uh, is all built around the idea that Trump is ungoverning America. That
yeah,
we always we when we vote, we everybody, Americans, Canadians, we think of we're voting people to come in and govern, right? We're going to run the machinery of state, and conservatives might want little, smaller government, and liberals and socialists might want bigger government. But everybody agrees that the president, the prime minister, everybody's going to run the machinery of government, except Trump. And this is an argument that Professor Russell Muirhead and Professor I forget her first name, but Rosenblum from Harvard, they set out in an article in Foreign Affairs early in September, and and Trump's what he's doing. The easiest metaphor to understand is he's throwing sand into the gears of the machinery of government. Who
right.
he appoints to run key agencies and departments like FBI and Justice and intelligence and all of that. Why are they incompetent? Why are there people that don't have they're loyalists. They're loyal to him. They're not competent people with a CV that would suggest they should do that job because he wants to break the machinery of government. That's the argument of these two professors. And then you extend that argument to Alberta because it's very clear Danielle Smith shares a lot of her philosophy and the way she runs the Alberta government with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Now, I would argue, and I will be arguing, that right now she's like Trump 1.0 from 2017 to 2020. There are still guardrails. Public opinion is still, prevents her from doing what she'd really like to do. But she describes herself as a libertarian populist. And so what she's doing is she is throwing sand into the machinery of government, which in Alberta includes public education. So she's starving it of resources, she's starving it of funding, and this kind of a conflict between the teachers and the and her education minister, Nicolaides, it's seen as a scrap over the future of public education. What will public education in Alberta look like? And so
Yeah.
there's a lot riding on this, and I would expect, based on kind of our thought, that she is like Trump 1.0 and ungoverning in that style, that bringing back to work legislation, invoking Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, is sand in the machinery of government, in this case, public education. And so she will do whatever she can to throw as much sand as she can. And the question becomes, and what we'll be looking at this afternoon, how much sand? What
Yeah.
type of sand? So that's how we're going to be approaching this story.
Well, and I mean, one could argue that yes, there is a current harm, kids not being in school, but what's the long-term harm if we completely dismantle public education? But I want to move on to the throne speech because that was also pretty interesting. I mean, she was giving herself a big pat on the back here. Uh, we might say a victory lap. So you interviewed Dwayne Bratt and talked about the analysis you guys had about the throne speech.
Dwayne Bratt is a political science professor at the Mount Royal University, and we interview him a lot because he's got a very good handle on the intricacies of politics in Alberta.
Hmm.
And so he described the throne speech, which is for those American viewers, which comes at the beginning of a legislative session. And so they've started the new one in Alberta. The first thing you do is you have a throne speech. It's delivered by the lieutenant governor, and which is the titular head of state in Canada. And we, of course, concentrated on the energy side of things, which in Smith's view, because the government actually writes the speech delivered by the lieutenant governor, but in Smith's view, that means oil and gas. And she has been,
Yeah.
and a couple of weeks ago, she sent out mandate letters to her cabinet ministers. And the one to Energy Minister Brian Jean was very explicit. And in my experience, I think this is the first time we've really seen her put down on paper and articulate her vision of where she wants to see oil and gas go. Lots of comments. I mean, she comments 3 times a day on this stuff. I mean, there's no question about what Danielle Smith wants, but here she is articulating that vision and instructing her energy minister to go implement that vision. So, double the oil production of Canada for Alberta from about 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day by 2050, build up to 5 pipelines, the West Coast, the Arctic, the north to Churchill, Manitoba, east to southern Ontario. These are all projects she's talked about, and push for LNG on the West Coast or wherever, so that Alberta gas can be used in those projects. And also they have
The
her government has an AI center,
yeah,
strategy
AI
where
data center.
she wants to attract data centers, and that will be powered by natural gas
Yeah.
power plants. All kinds of problems with that. I mean, first of all, how do you build power plants when you can't get turbines? It's like a 5 or 6 year
Yeah.
backlog on turbines. So there's a lot here, and what's interesting about this, and we will keep pounding on this theme, is the vision that Smith has for the oil and gas industry, which the oil and gas CEOs share, by the way. Like, I know they don't like her rough and tumble style. They don't like the way she does things and annoys the federal government, because that's a regulator that they have to deal with. They don't like, that's not their style. They're public corporations. They would prefer everything to be hashed out behind behind closed doors by
Yeah.
the suits, right? That's how they prefer things. But nevertheless, she carries their torch. And so that's fair enough. Um, but the dichotomy, the difference between what's happening at the global level and what Canadian political leaders and
Yeah.
industry think is happening at the global level. It's very clear based on the reporting we've done that the Prime Minister Mark Carney, Federal Energy Minister Tim Hodgson, Smith, Brian Jean, in British Columbia, Premier David Eby, and his Energy Minister Adrian Dix, all of them believe in the most bullish oil and gas scenarios for the next 25 years.
Yeah.
The International Energy Agency STEP scenario, OPEC
Hmm.
scenarios, ExxonMobil, Shell, UNIS, those are all very, very bullish scenarios. The problem is, at the global level, China is accelerating and pushing really, really hard on the electrification of Asian economies. That's where 80%
Right.
of the growth in energy demand will be out over the next 25 years. And our leaders think that that growth will be primarily in oil and gas. But the data and the evidence and the experts we interview say that no, they want electricity because they don't want to pay for imported oil and gas. It's expensive. I mean,
Yeah.
China spends like $325 billion a year just on oil imports. Why
Yeah.
not electrify, expand your power sector, electrify transportation, so 50%, 60% of their car sales are now have a plug, so on and so forth, and get yourself off oil, get yourself off imported LNG. And our officials, it's like nobody ever took them aside and said, "Hey boys, it's not playing out that way on the global stage. Things are not headed in that direction."
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like, we're the canary in the coal mine, here at Energy Media, because we do read the data and we do read the evidence and we do talk to the international experts. And so I don't know how they're missing the signals, but they are.
Well, let's talk about that because, you know, Carney seemed to be channeling Daniel Smith, overpromising fossil fuel expansion, hoarding this scenario where we're going to have, LNG targets. But you called him out on his math too this week, or I mean last week. So, we've talked about this a little bit about who are the customers going to be for this LNG. So
Okay, so
talk
the
to us
Prime
about what
Minister
Carney
this
did last
weekend
week.
was in Malaysia for the
Yes.
ASEAN summit. Most Asian nations, and then Trump was there, and Carney was there, and so on. And in his Sunday morning, in his closing remarks at the press conference, he said very clearly, he said, we want LNG to go from its current 14 million tons per annum to, and then so that's LNG Canada. It's the only functioning LNG plant in the country at the moment, but there are two under construction, two small ones, wood fiber and cedar, and they'll add another 5 million MTPA in a couple of years. So that'll bring us up to 19 million. He wants to go from 19 million MTPA to 50
50.
million. So that means the LNG Canada Phase 2. It means
Yep.
the Kashai Lisum First Nation project, which is 12 MTPA. That gets us up to about 45. Doesn't get us to 50, but it gets us to 45. If those two have not received final investment decisions yet. So they would have to. And then on top of that, that's by 2030. By then he wants to add double that again. So I took his remarks to mean that's another 100 MTPA
Yeah.
on top of the 50 we would already have in 2030. Folks, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to make that happen on the liquefaction side only. Then there's all the infrastructure, port
Yep.
expansion
Like
and
port. Yeah.
transmission lines and pipelines and all sorts of things that would have to be built at scale and at a speed, as Carney himself said, at a speed that we haven't seen in Canada since, the Second World War, 85 years ago. So the problem here is that, as we have said over and over again, and I quoted Bloomberg columnist Javier Blas in the video, because Javier Blas is known as being pretty oil and gas friendly. He's
Yeah.
that's his beat, and so he's pretty friendly. He wrote a column on October 9th, and he said LNG is becoming the bridge to nowhere, because what's happening is he read the same data we're reading, and it which clearly shows that Asia is electrifying. And
Yeah.
one of the ironies is that Carney was in Malaysia, and Malaysia has explicit in policy they have a strategy to eliminate oil and LNG imports. So in the very country where he made his announcement that Canada's going to double triple its output, and it's going to be a huge investment boom, that's the country that says we don't want your stuff. We don't want your oil. We don't want your gas. We're going to elect, even if we have to burn more coal. Don't get us wrong. We are going to electrify our
Try.
economy, and so that our cars aren't going to burn your gas, our buses aren't going to burn your gas, our homes aren't going to be heated by your natural gas, et cetera, et cetera. And there are three other countries in Asia that have explicit policies like that. And then there are another 9 or 10 that have implicit policies where it's all about electrification, and displacing oil and gas is kind of the consequence of that, even if it's not spelled out in
Right.
legislation. So how do you go to Malaysia and not understand this? How do you meet with other Asian leaders and not know about the policy framework in Asia to displace the very products that you say you're going to produce a lot more of? Now, I
Yeah.
don't doubt for a moment that Carney and his team are meeting with individual companies that are saying, hey, yeah, yeah, we're interested in your LNG. Sure, of course we are. Because of what they tell everybody,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they want to
Yeah.
diversify their supplies. They want a surplus of low cost of LNG. We're not low cost, folks. We're on the higher end. We're about $10 per MTPA, and you need to be half of that if your gas is going to be used in the power sector in Asia. So that's
Yeah.
off. And we've interviewed experts, including an Indian economist, about India. So our guys are flying by it's narrative and ideology that is driving their strategy, our strategy, Canada's strategy, not data and evidence. That's a serious, serious problem. The Prime Minister's commitment to conventional energy is not based on, despite the fact that he's an economist, he's got a PhD in economics, as we point out all the time. He's
Yeah.
not paying attention to the data. His officials are not paying attention to the data. He is, at the end of the day, a banker. And all you have to do is read the Canadian media to know that the bankers in this country are wetting themselves. They are so excited about all of this investment, which they will finance and make lots of money on. That's why they're involved in this. The fact
Yeah.
that there might not be customers, not their problem, you know.
Yeah.
So this is a big problem. There's a disconnect between the reality in Asia and the worldview in Canada, a disconnect. And that's
Yeah. And I mean, let's be clear, to be able to expand at as fast as what Carney was saying, and which he admitted, like you pointed out, there's going to be a lot of public investment required here. And who's going to be on the hook for that? Canadian taxpayers. So, I mean, this is a story that we want to follow closely, and we might also want to say, it's time to hold our leaders accountable. Like, what are you doing with our Canadian tax dollars?
yes, I thank you very much for bringing that up, because that really is the bow on the argument, right?
Yeah.
And that is, here's what I predict is going to happen. Carney has raised expectations around LNG to astronomical. I mean, just everybody's expecting it. The BC government of
Right.
BC is expecting it. The government of Alberta, you look at polls, Canadians are
Yeah.
expecting it. He's raised expectations way up here. And what's going to happen is because of the growing glut, and that's another thing we didn't talk about, but it's in the
Yes.
video. And there's the U.S., Qatar, and Australia leading the pack are bringing on over the next 2 years an increase of 50 to 60% more LNG production, more supply, which there's
Yeah.
going to be a glut out to 2040 or 2045 because of that.
Yeah.
So it's another wrinkle in this. And then there's the Power to Siberia 2 pipeline that got announced
Yes.
between Russia and China, which
China.
is literally 10% of total global demand.
Yeah.
That's how big this pipeline is going to be. So given that supply scenario, the companies are going to be reluctant to do FIDs. They're going to, well, hang on a second, the demand is softening, the supply is increasing, not a great time for us to be risking our capital. And Carney, because he's now got political capital invested in this, is going to go to them and say, how can I de-risk it? How can I
Yes.
de-risk it? Can I give you subsidies? Can I give you a break on regulations? Can we give you now this is the BC, this is not Carney, but there'll be, oh, can we give you a break on electricity? Can we build infrastructure for you at public cost? There'll be all of these things that'll be discussed behind closed doors in order to get those projects across the finish line. And how do we
Yeah.
know that? Because it happens every time. There
Yeah.
is never in Canada, or very rarely in Canada, do you find investments of these types that don't have public money involved in some form or fashion. And then when you make it urgent, politically urgent, the odds of having public money invested it goes up and up and up, the odds. So what we're arguing here at Energy Media, let me make it very clear. The data and the evidence suggest that there is significant risk attached to LNG development, which
Yeah.
means that if our prime minister has tremendous political capital involved in an industry that's getting economically riskier and riskier and riskier, our tax dollars are at risk. That is, and then there's stranded assets and there's a whole bunch of other things to consider, First Nations, Indigenous title, on and on. But fundamentally, our tax dollars are likely to be invested in a very, very risky business that is just coming up to its starting of its sunset phase.
Well, let's pivot gears here. I also want to talk about this this tantrum from Donald Trump over the weekend in reaction to this Ontario ad, this Ronald Reagan themed anti-tariff advertisement. So, what happened?
Okay, so last week, the government of Ontario had nothing to do with the Canadian government, which is involved in trade negotiations with Trump.
Yeah.
But the Ontario government created this 1 minute ad. It's playing on TVs down in the US. And I think it's a nothing burger. I mean, it really is kind of innocuous. Ronald Reagan had a nuanced view of tariffs, but he gave this very famous TV speech, publicly televised speech in 1987, where he talked about free trade. And he talked about how dangerous tariffs were. And remember, at that time, he and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney were negotiating the first free trade agreement, which
Right.
then was
NAFTA.
literally that agreement was the single biggest issue in the 1988 federal election. And I know because I voted.
Yeah.
I voted on it. I voted conservative because I liked the free trade agreement. I thought it was a good
Yeah.
idea. So he gave this address because he was supporting the negotiations that were going on with Canada, and he had a lot invested in getting the agreement. He was building political support in his own country for that agreement. And what Doug Ford and his comms team did is they took a minute of that address and then they overlaid video of tractors in the field and workers and on and on and on, because that's what Reagan was talking about.
Yeah.
So Trump wakes up Friday morning and he watches this, and he was really offended that he saw it during the advertisements during the first game of World
Yeah.
Series between the Toronto Blue Jays and the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he completely blew a gasket, completely. And he said, he canceled the ongoing trade talks with Mark Carney about the trade agreement, the Canada, U.S.,
Right.
Mexico trade agreement, CUSMA. He canceled that. He went on and on and on Truth Social. He just had how do you tell when Donald Trump has a mental fart? Lots of exclamation marks and caps, right, on
Yeah.
his Truth Social, and then there was lots of that. Then all of the his cat some of his cabinet ministers got in on the act, and all of the Trump proxies in the media, U.S. media, got in on the act, and just blew it up as they always do. I mean, this is the cycle, right? You get an
Yep.
issue, and then you spin it, spin it, spin it, and next thing you know, it's a big deal. So that's what they were doing on the American side. And the problem I had with that was the number of Canadian conservatives that jumped on that bandwagon. It's disgraceful.
Yeah.
From the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, which is Pierre Poilievre, all the way down to all of the proxies and the trolls and the whatever. Everybody was criticizing Carney in Canada, criticizing Canada when we had nothing to do with it. It was all the
Yeah.
Ontario government.
Ontario.
Yeah, and it was innocuous at that. All it did was it irritated Donald Trump. Big deal. He gets
Yeah.
irritated for everything. He's got the thinnest skin on the planet. By the
Yeah.
way, may I point out that before he became president, throughout his entire career in the media and everything, his MO was to pick fights with people. And the one I remember the most was his famous feud with Rosie O'Donnell. I don't know if you remember that kid. And for those kids who don't know who Rosie O'Donnell was, back in the day, she was a media personality in the U.S. She was gay and very feisty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she did, and so she and Donald Trump feuded in the media for years, years.
Well, I
And
didn't know this. I had no idea.
oh, you had no idea. Oh, yeah,
No,
no, it's very
I gotta
famous.
check it out.
And on top of that, Donald Trump was a frequent attendee and celebrity at WWE wrestling events,
Oh yeah. I did know that.
right? So
Hmm.
conflict and feuds, manufactured feuds, are part of his strategy, his
Yeah.
tactics to implement his strategy, which is why you don't get, you just don't respond to each one of these because it's what he does.
Yeah.
And the Canadian conservatives, who are not conservatives, by the way, and this is a really sticky point for me. I'm old enough to remember what conservatives are or were,
Yeah.
which is, traditional small government politicians.
Yep.
They believed in stability. They believed in the military. They believed all of that kind of stuff. What has happened in the last 10 years is that the libertarian populists, like Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith in Alberta, the libertarian populists have taken over the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And we've had political scientists on to explain, like Dwayne Bratt calls Danielle Smith a radical populist. Professor Jared Wesley from the University of Alberta calls her a libertarian populist, an authoritarian populist, which is I agree with. And
Yeah.
and so it's when I was taking AIM, and I got really angry. And a little point here, okay? And regular viewers will know this. And we've been around, almost 18 years, and so there's an MO here on our side. I get mad as hell on stuff like this. And I back in the 1970s, I played a little junior hockey and senior hockey, and it was a little rougher back in those days. And the idea of dropping the mitts, elbows up, I mean, that was just how everybody played. And when you had somebody like Trump or these conservative proxies and they were hacking and slashing and playing dirty, you might have a line brawl. You might drop the mitts and go toe to toe because it was emotional, it was passionate, and that's what you did. And I play social media the same way.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid to get my elbows up, and I'm not afraid to call a spade a shovel, and be pretty blunt when I have to, when I think it's called for. And in this case, it's definitely called for. There was no need for those conservative MPs, for Polyev, for all of their supporters to pile on Canada to support Trump. That's shameful. And I called them traitors because
Yeah.
I believe that when our country is in a conflict with the United States, our ally and supposed friend, well, 150, 160 years of being a friend, you support Canada. And especially when we're in the right and they're in the wrong. And
Yeah.
especially when it's Donald Trump in the wrong. There is no excuse for any Canadian to be on the side of Donald Trump in this dispute. None.
Yeah.
And I was very plain in the two pieces I did. And in fact, in the second one, I said, okay, you want, because remember, Donald Trump slapped a 10% tariff on top of
Yes.
all other tariffs on Canada because he didn't like the ad. I
Yeah.
mean, goodness gracious. You don't like a TV ad, so you punish the economy of the other. That's nuts. That's not how
It's
government should be
wild.
run.
Yeah.
So we're being punished economically, and all of these proxies are out there siding with Trump. And what I said is, you know what? The travel boycott, it's not a ban because this is all voluntary, but travel to the United States is down 30, 40, 50%, depending on the type and region and so on. I said,
Yeah.
make it 100%.
Yeah.
Stop going to the United States for anything. I get it. If you
Yeah.
got, you have business down there, you have to go, fine. Snowbirds, stay home. Folks who live near the border, like I used to do when we lived in White Rock, BC, and the border is like 3 miles, 3 kilometers
Yeah.
away, stop going down there for groceries and gas. Stop, stop, stop. Do not go there anymore. If they want to treat us like that, this is one of the things that Canadians can do, is already doing. Las Vegas, for example, is running ads in
Hurting.
Canada begging Canadians to go back because their
Yeah.
hotels are empty.
Yeah.
They're hurting. We'll hurt them
Yeah.
more. Hurt them more. Take another shot. Give them another elbow because they're not getting the message. Trump is not
Yeah.
getting the message. So hit them harder. That
Yeah.
was the thrust of my video. I believe it, and I'll defend that. I'll die on that hill because we got to stand up for. Here's the thing:
Yeah.
there were MPs talking about, oh my God, we can't do. Have you ever been in a schoolyard with a bully, MC?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay. I don't know what it's like for women, for girls, but I know what boys put up with. And I have had my fair share of run-ins with bullies when I was a kid. And here's the one thing you need to know, and this is kind of like common knowledge, but you give the bully today's lunch money, he's back tomorrow for that day's lunch money, and he won't stop
Yeah.
until you get some steel in your spine and you stand up to the bully. He's coming back for your lunch money. And this is where we have to draw the line and show some steel in our spine. So
Yeah.
no travel to the United States as long as this is going on. Stay home.
Yeah.
Patronize your own businesses. Get to know your own country because this bully is coming for tomorrow's lunch money, and God damn it, he can't have it.
100% agree with you on that, Mark. I mean, it's gonna be a big week this week. We see what's gonna happen, with these new 10% tariffs. We've got this possible province-wide action happening in Alberta. I mean, there's a lot, folks. We are going to be covering all of it. We will bring you breaking news as it comes in, and we hope to see you back again next week. Please like and subscribe our channel, like our content, share our content. Last week we had a lot of sharing of our content, which we appreciate so much that our viewers are coming back for more and sharing it with their friends. So please do the same. And if you really like our content, you can always join our channel as a paying member. We really appreciate that, supporting independent media and letting Markham do what he does best, which is get you the stories. So with that, Markham, I'll turn it over to you for the last word.
Well, I've spoken extensively about the stories we covered last week, and some of them are going to bleed into this week, like the teacher
Yep.
strike in Alberta, and we haven't heard the end of Donald Trump. This is going to go on. This is going to go on for a while. So we'll do our very best.
Absolutely.
But I want to draw viewers' attention to the series of interviews we're going to do on the Trump Project 2025 and Canada series, because
Yep.
this is a deep dive into, and here's a little interesting tidbit for you, MC. I've been contacting like Russ Muirhead, the Dartmouth professor who co-wrote that America Ungoverning America article. It's coming on. I think it's tomorrow. We've got him scheduled for a long interview. And I've been reaching out to other American academics. They are tickled pink that a Canadian is taking interest in this because they've read the Project 2025 document. They've been studying what Trump is doing inside government, not the stuff
Yeah.
you hear about in Fox News and on CNN, the stuff he's really doing, how he's doing it, his team is doing it. They want to talk about it because nobody in the US is talking about it publicly. The media isn't interested in it. It's very hard. There's some podcasters and Substack writers and so on, but for the most part, it's not being talked about. So when a Canadian journalist comes to them and says, "Hey, we're going to do this and we want to go in depth, we want to go deep on some of these ideas," man, they're
Yeah.
so happy to talk. And so we've got a number of experts lined up already, and we'll be bringing you a lot more, and we'll be drawing. So you're going to learn what Trump is up to, what his strategy is, what are his tactics, how he implements those tactics, and then we're going to draw the connections to Canada because everything that happens in the US comes to Canada eventually, right?
Yeah.
And it's already here in the form of Maple Mega and Alberta. So that keep an eye on that. I'm kind of proud of the work we're doing on this because we had one of our viewers, Idris Fashion from Edmonton, who I've known him for years on social media, and he said, "Markham, you're the only journalist in Canada that had the cojones to do that story.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, we'll see. But we're doing that story."
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about that. I think our viewers are going to love it. So stay tuned, folks, and remember to subscribe to the channel so you get every update as it comes out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.